Greetings to everyone. Welcome back to our Form 4 biology videos. Today we'll dive into the microscopic world of protozoa, which are single-celled organisms belonging to Kingdom Protista. Okay, examples of protozoa are Amoeba species and Paramecium species. And protozoa come in various shapes and sizes. They are either free-living in the pond water or other types of environments, or parasitic, meaning that they may live in the bodies of living organisms and cause diseases. So it's interesting to find out how these protozoa carry out the various living processes and the variety of ways that they can carry out locomotion, nutrition, and also reproduction. Okay, so they live in a wide variety of moist habitats such as fresh water, marine water or environment, and the moist soil. Okay, so I also have a mystery guest here for you to also discover. All right, and let's dive into the microscopic world of protozoa to find out more about these interesting unicellular organisms that can carry out the 7 life processes. Learning standards. So the learning standards for today's lesson are as follows. 2.2 Living processes in unicellular organisms. First learning standard. After this lesson, we should be able to conceptualize, meaning to build up concepts or ideas of the living processes in unicellular organisms such as Amoeba species and Paramecium species. All right, and also we should be able to explain how these processes are carried out in the protozoa here. All right, so these 7 living processes are, for example, reproduction, locomotion, nutrition, and also excretion, as seen here. All right, so it's interesting to find out how unicellular organisms can carry out the 7 living processes just like multicellular organisms. Okay, because unicellular organisms are only made up of 1 cell each, right? So how do they carry out reproduction or locomotion, right? So these 2 organisms here that we're going to study in our syllabus have different ways of carrying out locomotion and also nutrition. So it's interesting to find out the various ways in which they can do it. Now, number 2, we should be able to deduce living processes in unicellular organisms as seen through a light microscope, right? So for this aspect, we have a special guest, a mystery guest, which is not Amoeba species or Paramecium species. Okay, so it's interesting to also find out, and let's see whether we can deduce the living processes in another organism, all right, apart from Amoeba species and Paramecium species, as an enrichment activity. Okay, so it's quite interesting. So, but for our syllabus, we have to know about the living processes in 2 unicellular organisms only, and that's Amoeba species and Paramecium species. So one day I took a drop of water from a school pond and looked at it under the microscope. I put it on a slide and observed the drop of water under the microscope with a magnification of about 100 to 150 times. And then I saw something strange, all right? A little guy like this one here. There were lots of these organisms. Now, what is this? Is it a fish? Is it a cockroach? Water cockroach? Is it a biscuit? No, it's none of that. So this is our mystery guest, which we will find out more about at the end of this video. Okay, after studying the processes, living processes in Amoeba and Paramecium species. So for a start, let's just look at this little teeny weeny creature that cannot be seen with the naked eye and observe some of its characteristics and also living processes here. So let's discover more about living processes in unicellular organisms. Now, what are unicellular organisms? They are organisms that are made of only one cell. Okay. However, this one cell is a complete unit of life, like multicellular organisms. All right. So even though it's just one cell, it can carry out all the life or living processes. And there are 7 of these processes: respiration, movement, nutrition, responding to stimulus, reproduction, growth, and excretion. So one example of unicellular organisms are the protozoans. Okay, others are bacteria and some forms of algae and so forth. All these are unicellular organisms. So examples of protozoans are amoeba species, as shown here. And then we have Paramecium species and Euglena species. All right. So notice that when we write the name for all these protozoa, it's their names. All right. So we have to have this, the first letter of the word, for example, amoeba, is capital letters, capital A or capital P here for Paramecium and capital E for Euglena. Then species. All right. So SP stands for species, not Sungai Petani, species. So species here means the type of amoeba, which we do not know. Okay, there's actually the species name is written here, but since we are just referring generally to amoeba, we call them all amoeba species. Okay, without referring to any specific species of amoeba. Okay, so this is the way that you write the name for amoeba species, Paramecium species, and Euglena species. Now, so in this syllabus, we need to study 2 protozoa, which are amoeba and Paramecium. But we also need to be able to recognize some other protozoa like Euglena, which has a flagellum, a tail-like structure, okay, that you can move from left to right in order to help it to swim. And Euglena is special because it has chloroplasts, so it can carry out photosynthesis. All right, whereas amoeba and Paramecium species, amoeba species and Paramecium species cannot carry out photosynthesis, and they eat the other unicellular organisms like bacteria and algae and other stuff. Right? So these are the 7 life processes or living processes that we're going to study today. That is carried out by amoeba species and Paramecium species. So how do these protozoa carry out the 7 life processes, such as movement, nutrition, reproduction, sensitivity, respiration, excretion, and growth? Right? Now, first of all, to remember the 7 life or living processes, remember this word, MRS, M-R-S, ring. Okay? R-E-N-N-G, Mrs. Ring. So here we have all the 7 life or living processes. Okay? So let's find out how amoeba species and Paramecium species carry out these life processes, even though they are just one cell. Okay, each one consists of only one cell. So firstly, we're going to talk about the habitat of amoeba and Paramecium. So the habitat is the place or environment where the organism naturally lives and grows. Okay, so amoeba lives in freshwater lakes and ponds, and some are free living. That means they don't live in the bodies of other organisms. Okay, they live independently in the water, in the freshwater lakes and ponds. But others are parasitic. So there are types of amoeba, species of amoeba that live in the bodies of organisms, and these can cause diseases, right? So we are going to focus more on the free-living amoeba species that live in freshwater lakes and ponds, right? So amoeba species that's free-living eats the algae, bacteria, and other microorganisms found in the pond. All right. Now, how about Paramecium species? For Paramecium species here, it lives in freshwater and marine environments. So there are different species of Paramecium, and some are adapted to live in freshwater, ponds and lakes, whereas others live in marine environments. All right, for example, where there's salt water or in the sea. So we're going to focus on those that live in fresh water. All right, they can be found in stagnant ponds that have decaying organic matter. So when this organic matter decay, they will cause bacteria to grow, multiply, and reproduce. All right, that decompose the organic matter, and then this will attract the Paramecium species that eats the bacteria. So Paramecium species feeds on microorganisms such as bacteria, algae, and yeast. So a few more facts, extra facts that may come in helpful is that we need to know the mode of nutrition, right? So both protozoa, amoeba species and Paramecium species, are called heterotrophs because they cannot produce their own food, not like plants, which are called autotrophs. Okay, so they cannot produce their own food. That's why they're called heterotrophs. They actually obtain nutrients by eating other organisms, such as bacteria. So they can't carry out photosynthesis. And their mode of nutrition is that they are heterotrophic, and specifically they carry out holozoid nutrition, in which the food is swept into the cell, or like in Paramecium, the food is swept into the cell and the food vacuole is formed. Or for amoeba, it will engulf the food and then it will form the food vacuole. Okay, so the food is ingested, taken into the cell, and then it is digested by using the enzymes in the body or in the cell. Okay, that is called holozoid nutrition. So first, let's discuss the structure of amoeba species. Now, amoeba species has an irregular shape. There's no fixed shape. Amoeba species that does not have a fixed shape because as it moves, its shape will change. So it has a plasma membrane, all right, surrounding the cytoplasm, and the cytoplasm has two parts. The outer layer is very thin, it's called the ectoplasm, and the inner layer that comprises more of the cell is the endoplasm. All right. Then in the endoplasm, we have organelles such as the nucleus, a contractile vacuole to sort of excrete the excess water, and then there are also food vacuoles where the food is being digested, and lysosomes. Lysosomes contain the hydrolytic enzymes to digest the food in the food vacuoles. Okay, then it can move by extending its pseudopodia, which are like false feet, in the direction that it wants to move. It will extend the pseudopodium forward, and then the cytoplasm will flow into the pseudopodium. Pseudo means false, podium is the feet. Okay, so the structure is quite simple. And let's look at one more protozoa, which is the Paramecium species, which is we can say that it's more complex than amoeba. So Paramecium species has a slipper shape. Okay, it's shaped like a slipper. All right, but the head is not at the pointed tip. The head or the anterior end of the front end is the blunt end here. So when it moves, this part will go first. Okay, the blunt end will go first. And then its plasma membrane is covered with fine hairs called cilia. Okay, that helps it to move around. Singular form is cilium. All right, now later we'll have the notes on the next slide, and you can refer to these points. Okay, so on one side here is an oral groove leading to a cytostome, which is the opening. It's like the opening of the cell. All right, so the oral groove is like a channel that channels the food to the cytostome or cell mouth, and after this opening, the food will go into the gullet. So the gullet is something like for us humans is the esophagus. So here is the gullet, and then at the end of the gullet, the food vacuole will start to form. So the food will be enclosed in a food vacuole. All right, and then these food vacuoles will travel around the paramecium inside the cell, and it is being digested as it travels around the cell. Okay, so these are all the food vacuoles containing food in them, such as bacteria or algae. Then in the cytoplasm, there are two nuclei. Amoeba has only got one nucleus, but Paramecium has two nuclei. So there is a micronucleus, which is smaller, and a macronucleus, which is bigger. All right, we'll find out the function later on. Now, actually, the macronucleus is involved in controlling the metabolic activities in the cell, and the micronucleus is involved in sexual reproduction called conjugation, which we'll study afterwards. All right, so there are two contractile vacuoles, unlike amoeba, which has only one round contractile vacuole. For Paramecium, the contractile vacuole is like a flower shape. All right, but the main part where the which will contract and expel the water is the rounded part here, which we can see in the on the slides of living, when we observe the living Paramecium. Contractile vacuole can expand as it stores the excess water, and then it will contract to pump out the water. Okay, so it's involved in controlling the water balance in the cell, or we call that process osmoregulation. So we'll be studying more about osmoregulation afterwards. So these are the notes for the structure of amoeba species and Paramecium species. So you see the AM here, it means it's only for amoeba. And you see a PA, okay, beside the structure, that means this is only found in Paramecium. Okay, so these notes are for you to jot down if you want to find out more or remember the structures and their functions. Okay, so this will be a more complete set of notes if you can copy them down. For example, let's read through this very quickly. Pseudopodia, singular form is pseudopodium. Temporary projection of the amoeba species cell is filled with cytoplasm and is used by amoeba in locomotion or movement and in the feeding, which is called phagocytosis. Contractile vacuole is an organelle that carries out osmoregulation. That means the control of water balance in the cell. So it stores excess water that diffuses into the organism, like amoeba and amoeba species and Paramecium, and it contracts to excrete the excess water. So in amoeba, there's only one contractile vacuole, but in Paramecium, there are two contractile vacuoles. Food vacuole is also found both in Paramecium and amoeba. It's a sac in which the food is digested using lysozymes from lysosomes. And lysosomes, there are sacs that contains a lysosome is a sac that contains hydrolytic enzymes called lysozymes to digest the food. Okay, now cilia, singular form is cilium. It's only found in Paramecium. Hair-like projections in Paramecium species used in locomotion and sweeping of food into the oral groove. Oral groove is a channel. Okay, now this is the oral groove here. All right, a channel lined with cilia that sweeps the food into the cytostome or mouth opening. So cytostome is the cell mouth or pore by which food particles enter the Paramecium. All right, and then it allows the food vacuole to be formed in order to digest the food in the food vacuole. Food vacuole has to be formed. Now, macronucleus. Macronucleus is the bigger nucleus. Macro means bigger, bigger. So it controls metabolic activities of Paramecium species. Okay, so examples of metabolic activities are like respiration, maybe digestion, and so forth. Now, micronucleus contains genetic material. All right, the small little nucleus contains genetic material, so it is involved in sexual reproduction by conjugation, which we will study later. The first living process that we will discuss is movement. Right, so amoeba species and Paramecium species have different ways of moving in the pond water, all right, in the habitat. For amoeba, it can change its shape when it encounters obstacles. Now, how does it actually move? So firstly, amoeba species moves by extending out its pseudopodium, all right, and then this pseudopodium is the false feet. Pseudo means false, and podium means the feet. Okay, so plural form is pseudopodia, dia. So first it will extend out its pseudopodia slowly, and after that the cytoplasm will flow into the pseudopodia. Okay, and that's all there is to its movement. So it's very slow and steady. The extension of the pseudopodia is very slow, but it moves ahead, right? And that's followed by the flow of the cytoplasm. How about Paramecium? So Paramecium has a different mode of moving or locomotion because it has tiny hair-like structures on the surface of its body, and these are called the cilia. As you can see here, cilia, and this cilia can sweep back and forth. Here you can sweep forward, and then after that it will lower down and it will sweep backwards. Okay, so if it wants to move forward, it will the cilia will be swept forward very quickly and with force. Okay, and then after that it will move back again with less force, and then it will again move forward. In this way, the Paramecium is able to move forward, but as it moves, it will rotate. All right, it will rotate on its own axis here, and also not just that. As it rotates, it will rotate in a spiral pattern. Okay, so if you have ever watched Paramecium under the microscope, on the slide, under the microscope, you will see that it moves very quickly using this type of movement, rotating movement. Okay, so we say that Paramecium species moves using rhythmic beating of cilia. Okay, so the cilia will beat or sweep forward, backward, forward, backward. Okay, it's a fixed pattern. Now the second living process is nutrition. All right, so this question on nutrition is a past year question that has come up before in the structured section, where a diagram like this was given, and the student has to explain the process step by step. Okay, so let's see how amoeba carries out feeding and nutrition. So firstly, amoeba moves towards the food. It approaches the food particles by extending its pseudopodium or pseudopodia, and then after that it will trap the food. Let's look at the second diagram here. It moves towards the food, then it will extend its pseudopodia and trap the food particles by phagocytosis. Okay, so when it traps the food, it will surround the food, engulf the food. We say that engulfs the food and form a food vacuole. So number 2, lysosomes will then fuse to the food vacuole that is formed. Okay, so the food vacuole is the green one inside here, and then this yellow one is the lysosome. It contains digestive enzymes, all right, which are called lysozymes. Now thirdly, the enzyme lysozyme from the lysosomes will then be secreted or will move into the food vacuole and hydrolyze the food particles. Hydrolyze here means to digest and break down the food particles. Just like humans have enzymes to digest their food and break down the food particles. So once the food particles have been broken down into simpler substances, then the nutrients can be absorbed into the cytoplasm, right? And then number 5, undigested food is discharged when the amoeba species moves away from the place. Okay, so here you can see that I've underlined some of these keywords, all right, and the words in different color, like blue color, are some of the keywords that you need to write in your answer, whether it's an essay, question, or structured question. So I remember the one that came out for SPM is worth about 3 to 4 marks in the structured question, where they show all these pictures, and you have to be able to explain step by step. All right, the process of phagocytosis and feeding in amoeba. Now, how about nutrition in Paramecium? Is it similar to amoeba? Well, the first stage is not very alike. Now, amoeba uses its pseudopodia to engulf the food particle and then form the food vacuole. But for Paramecium, it doesn't have pseudopodia. So it uses the beating of cilia, the sweeping motion of the cilia that is found at the oral groove here on the surface of the cell body here, right? And this cilia will sweep the food particles into the oral groove here, and then the food will pass through the cytostome or cell mouth, and then pass the gullet here. The gullet is like an esophagus, okay, within inverted commas. And finally, the food will be enclosed in food vacuoles. Okay, right. So this part is different between amoeba and paramecium. Because paramecium uses the beating of cilia to sweep the food into the oral groove, but amoeba uses pseudopodia to engulf the food. Then the remaining parts are quite alike. Okay, so after the food is in the food vacuole, okay, the food vacuole is produced and it fuses with an organelle called the lysosome, which has digestive enzymes, right? Same like amoeba. And after that, the enzyme lysozyme in the lysosomes will hydrolyze the food particles, meaning will digest the food particles and break them down into simpler substances, so that the nutrients, the simple nutrients, can be absorbed into the cytoplasm along the way. And then as the vacuole continues to travel around the cell, right, the food is being digested by lysozymes and nutrients are being absorbed into the cytoplasm, and then the vacuole will reach the anus. Just imagine this tiny cell even has an anus. Okay, so at this point, the undigested food in the vacuole is then discharged through the anus here, right, which is quite near to the oral groove. Okay, so let's take a look at how this process occurs. All right, and we'll see the animation here. Okay, now see this is a food particle. So it will be swept in into the oral groove and into the gullet by using the cilia, okay, with the help of cilia. And then the food will be enclosed in a food vacuole, and then food vacuole will travel around the cell, and at the same time the food is being digested by the lysozymes from lysosomes. And finally, when the food vacuole reaches the anus, all right, the undigested food is discharged through the anus. The third living process that we are going to study is reproduction. So amoeba has two methods of reproduction. Firstly, if the condition is favorable or suitable, with plenty of food, amoeba species reproduces via asexual reproduction, that is binary fission through mitosis. Now, binary fission means the process of splitting up into a few parts or division, right? So firstly, the amoeba will grow to a certain size, and then it carries out the binary fission. Okay, not binary fusion, binary fission. So first the nucleus divides, and then the cytoplasm divides. And at the end of it, after division of cytoplasm, two daughter amoebae are formed from one parent cell. So this is a form of asexual reproduction because only one parent cell is involved, right? And mitosis here means a type of cell division, which we'll study in another chapter. Okay, not to worry, but you can remember as cell division, all right? Now, how about in unsuitable environmental conditions or unfavorable conditions? For example, when the conditions are too dry, there's low temperature, and there's a food shortage. Okay, so amoeba will not reproduce by binary fission in this case. All right, it will form spores that will only germinate when the environment improves. So let's have a look. How does amoeba form spores? Okay, now so this is a cell of amoeba species. It looks like a fried egg, and firstly, in the formation of spores, the nuclei will form many daughter nuclei, right? And then how does it form the daughter nuclei? We don't have to know. So each daughter nuclei will be surrounded by a wall also, and there's some cytoplasm inside too. So the wall of the spore here is may help the cell to be resistant to the unfavorable conditions. Okay, so it will be in this state, all right, until the conditions are suitable. Okay, and when the spores come out from the parent cell, right, it will germinate. All right, To germinate means that the tiny young amoeba will come out from each spore. Okay, so there'll be many of these amoeba from one cell, one parent cell. All right, and then this young amoeba can then grow and mature in the favorable conditions. Okay, so formation of spores occur when the environmental conditions are not suitable or unfavorable. Okay, so this is again a type of asexual reproduction. Why? Because only one parent cell is involved. So amoeba doesn't produce by sexual reproduction, only by asexual or non-sexual reproduction involving one parent cell. Reproduction in Paramecium species. So in suitable conditions with plenty of food, Paramecium species reproduces via asexual reproduction, that is binary fission by mitosis. This is similar to amoeba species in suitable conditions. Okay, so in binary fission, first the nuclei will divide. Since the Paramecium species cell has two nuclei, thus both nuclei will divide. The macronucleus and micronucleus will divide. After that, the cytoplasm will divide, and finally two daughter Paramecium cells are formed. Okay, similar to amoeba species. How about in unsuitable or unfavorable environmental conditions? This is where it differs. All right, Paramecium is different from amoeba species because it doesn't form spores. Instead, it carries out sexual reproduction, that is conjugation, whereby two cells of Paramecium species come together and exchange genetic material. Okay, so conjugation means the union of two unicellular organisms, temporary union, in order to exchange genetic material, as is shown here. You see these two Paramecium cells, the parent cells. They are joined together, they stick together at their oral grooves, and they exchange genetic material. After that, they separate. Now these two resulting cells have different genetic content compared to the parents. Then these cells will individually undergo cell division to form 4 daughter cells each. So altogether 8 daughter cells are formed from a pair of Paramecium species cells. Okay, so this is a type of sexual reproduction because two parents are involved. Instead of one. And the word conjugation means the union of two unicellular organisms in order to exchange genetic material. So why do they need to exchange their genetic material? Probably is to increase the genetic variation in Paramecium, to make sure that the offspring or the anak will be genetically different from the parents. So this will improve their chances of adapting to changes in the environment. And this will increase their chances of survival. Okay, when they are genetically different from each other, some of these cells may be able to survive, whereas others will die. But some may be able to survive, and there is a continuation of the species. Right, let's look at these two diagrams here. Now, what type of reproduction is going on here in this first diagram? We can see that there are two Paramecia. Okay, now sometimes we can call them Paramecia, P-A-R-A-M-E-C-I-A, that's the plural form of Paramecium. Okay, or two cells of Paramecium species here, and they are slowly dividing and splitting. Then you can see now they're joined head to head, then they're going to separate. So this type of reproduction is binary fission or conjugation? Yes, it's binary fission. Similar to this one here. Okay, binary fission. However, for this one, you can see that the cells, Paramecium cells, are side by side. So what type of reproduction is this? Yes, it's sexual reproduction by conjugation. Okay. Now the fourth living process is excretion. Okay, so all the living processes that we are going to discuss after this starting from excretion, will be similar in Paramecium and Amoeba species. Okay, so firstly, excretion means the removal of certain substances that are unwanted or waste products, right? Removal of these substances from the body. So waste products like carbon dioxide and ammonia are removed by diffusion. Okay, so what is diffusion actually? Now in diffusion, for example, for carbon dioxide will diffuse or move through the plasma membrane from region of higher concentration in the cell, where it's produced through respiration, into region of lower concentration outside the cell, and that is in the environment. Okay, so because the concentration of carbon dioxide is higher in the cell compared to outside the cell, so carbon dioxide will diffuse down its concentration gradient from region of higher concentration to region of lower concentration, okay, by simple diffusion through the plasma membrane. Similarly, the same thing goes for ammonia, which is produced in the cell. It will diffuse out into the environment. And this process doesn't require any energy. It's a natural process. Okay. Now, but there's one more process, which is the excretion of water, right? So this topic has come out in the exam before, quite often. And the question is, how is water excreted from the cell? Okay. So first of all, we have to understand that Amoeba species and Paramecium species both live in a freshwater environment. So freshwater environment, okay, is an environment that has high concentration of water, but low concentration of salts. All right. So we say this is a dilute solution. It's like a dilute solution with a lot of water, but less salts. Compared to the cytoplasm and the content inside the cell, which has higher concentration of salts and lower concentration of water. So because of the difference in the concentration of water inside and outside the cell, the water will diffuse into the cell constantly by osmosis, which is a form of diffusion, diffusion of water from region of high concentration outside the cell into region of lower concentration of water in the cell. Okay. Now, if the Paramecium and Amoeba species do not do anything about this, their cells will expand until they burst because of the huge amount of water, okay, that has diffused into the cells. Thus, they must have a mechanism or a process to excrete the excess water from the cell, constantly excrete the excess water from the cell. Okay, so the water will fill the contractile vacuole. For Amoeba, it has one contractile vacuole only, but for Paramecium, there are two, and there seems to be like a flower-shaped pattern here. Okay, so for Paramecium, it has a vacuole at the anterior end here and one vacuole at the posterior end. So water fills the contractile vacuole, and when the vacuole expands to the maximum size, it contracts. It doesn't burst, it contracts. Okay, and then all the excess water will be excreted out of the cell through the plasma membrane, just like, you know, a water pump, pumping the water out of a place. So this process is known as osmoregulation. Okay, and it means the process of controlling the water content to maintain the osmotic pressure, which involves the concentration of salts and water in the cell. All right, so we'll find out more about osmotic pressure and osmoregulation in the next topic. Okay, but anyway, we have to know that the vacuole, contractile vacuole, not foot vacuole, contractile vacuole is involved in osmoregulation. This word, contractile vacuole. Okay, so it comes from the word contract, because the vacuole will contract constantly to expel excess water. All right, so don't use the word burst, it should be contract. Now let's look at an animation here to show you how you would be able to observe how would this process look like under the microscope. And afterwards, even in our mystery gas organism, there's another organism, you will see this vacuole at work. Okay, so when water enters the cell through osmosis, diffuses into the cell through osmosis, it will fill the contractile vacuole. Contractile vacuole will expand, and then and expanded to maximum size, it contracts to excrete the excess water, as shown here. Okay, now contract, expands and then contracts. Okay, expands as it's filled up water and then contracts. So it's like water pumps. These are like water pumps. The next living process is responding to stimuli. So for amoeba species and paramecium species, they are organisms that can carry out this process of responding to stimuli. So stimuli are the changes in the environment which are detected by these organisms. Okay, so they can be food or chemicals, touch or bright light. All right, and depends on whether these stimuli are adverse stimuli or favorable stimuli. So if there is food, they will move towards food. They respond by moving towards food. But for harsh chemicals like acids and touch and also bright light, they will move away from this adverse stimuli. Okay, so bright light and acid, all right, stimulate them and they will move away from this stimuli, these changes in the environment which they detect. Now, number 6, what is the sixth living process that can be carried out by these unicellular organisms? Respiration. Okay, so for respiration, the two organisms allow the exchange of gases such as oxygen and carbon dioxide through the plasma membrane by simple diffusion. Okay, so for example, the concentration of oxygen in the cell, like amoeba cell of amoeba species or cell of paramecium species. So the concentration of oxygen in these cells is lower than that in the environment because oxygen is always used up in respiration. Okay, so because of that, because there's a difference in concentration of oxygen and difference in concentration of the gases carbon dioxide, thus for oxygen, oxygen will diffuse from region of higher concentration in the environment into the cell, okay, by simple diffusion. And for carbon dioxide is the opposite because carbon dioxide is always produced in the cell through cellular respiration. So the concentration of carbon dioxide is always higher in the cell than in the environment, right? So carbon dioxide will diffuse from region of high concentration in the cell into the environment, which has lower concentration of carbon dioxide. All right. So for both organisms, the process of respiration is the same. And also for the process of responding to stimuli is the same for both these organisms. Now for the final one, the seventh living process, what is it? Growth. So amoeba species and paramecium species grow by synthesizing new cytoplasm, okay, using the nutrients that they have obtained from the environment. Okay, they will synthesize new cytoplasm and grow larger and larger. Now, let's look at a summary of what we have discussed by comparing amoeba species and paramecium species. Okay, so when we compare these two organisms, we can first of all, we can discuss the similarities and then the differences. All right. So what are the similarities between amoeba species and paramecium species? Now, firstly, both amoeba species and paramecium species are unicellular organisms classified as members of the kingdom called Protista, which we will study in Form 5. All right. And number 2, both amoeba species and paramecium species live in freshwater ponds and lakes. Okay. For example, many paramecium species live in freshwater ponds and lakes. And then number 3, both are sensitive to external stimuli, such as light, temperature, chemicals, and touch. Okay, and they can move away from stimuli that are adverse to them, that are not favorable to them. Number 4, both reproduce asexually by binary fission in favorable conditions. All right, so this is one similarity that is quite obvious. And in both organisms, exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide gases occur through the plasma membrane by the process of simple diffusion. Okay, where oxygen, for example, oxygen diffuses from region of higher concentration in the environment into the cell through the plasma membrane. Number 6, both grow by synthesizing new cytoplasm. Now let's look at the differences. So this is a summary of the differences. Now, from the aspect of structure, Amoeba species has an irregular shape, whereas Paramecium has a shape like a slipper. And secondly, Amoeba has a plasma membrane that is not covered with cilia, right? But for Paramecium, its plasma membrane is covered with cilia, which are fine hairs. Thirdly, for Amoeba species, the cytoplasm consists of two parts, the ectoplasm and endoplasm. But in Paramecium species, its cytoplasm is not divided into two parts. And fourthly, in Amoeba species, it has there's only one nucleus, but in Paramecium species, there are two nuclei, the micronucleus and the macronucleus. Then for locomotion, both have different ways of moving around. For Amoeba species, it moves by forming pseudopodia, and then there's the flow of cytoplasm into the pseudopodia. For Paramecium species, it moves by the beating of cilia. That means the rhythmic moving of the cilia, which we call cilia beats. Now, thirdly, from the aspect of nutrition, is again different for Amoeba species and Paramecium species, especially in the way that they ingest the food, they take in the food. The way they take in the food is different. For Amoeba species, it engulfs its food by using the pseudopodia, right? But in Paramecium species, it's the cilia that sweeps the food into the oral groove and the cell mouth, which we call the cytostome. Okay. Then the other aspects are the same already. That means after the food has been engulfed or ingested by both these cells, okay, it has gone into the cytoplasm. The food vacuoles are formed, and then food is digested by the enzyme lysozyme from the lysosomes. So the lysosomes will fuse to the food vacuoles, and then the enzymes from lysosomes will digest the food in the food vacuoles. Now for Amoeba, the whole process is called phagocytosis, where they engulfs the food and then digest it using enzymes. For Paramecium, after the food has already gone into the cytoplasm, again the food vacuoles are formed, and again the food is digested by lysozymes, which are enzymes from the lysosomes. Now for reproduction, Amoeba species reproduces asexually by binary fission and by forming spores. So both are asexual, both are forms of asexual reproduction, both are types of asexual reproduction. But for Paramecium species, it has something extra. Okay, it produces asexually by binary fission, and it can also reproduce. It reproduces asexually by binary fission, and it can also reproduce sexually, okay, by conjugation, where two cells of Paramecium species come together and join together, all right, side by side, and then they exchange genetic material. Okay, so that is a form of sexual reproduction. Right, so let's come back to our mystery guess. Can you guess what it is? What type of organism is this? Yes, it's actually a protozoa like Paramecium species. It belongs to the same group of protozoans like the Paramecium species, and this group is considered to be the most complex of all the protozoas. Okay, so the name for this organism is Euplotes species. It is a protozoa, and here are some facts about it. It lives in fresh water like Paramecium species. It has a lot of cilia, all right, cilia, these extensions here and here, or cirri, which helps it to walk, to swim, swim when the cilia is moving, to help it to swim, and or also even to walk on surfaces, like to crawl on surfaces, like a cockroach like that, right? So let's view the video to find out what are the living processes in this organism? According to learning standard number 2, we should be able to deduce living processes in unicellular organisms as seen through a light microscope, okay, at the end of this lesson. So even though Euplotes species is not, we don't need to study it in our syllabus, but it's very interesting to observe it and apply our knowledge, the knowledge of what we have studied about Paramecium and our knowledge of Paramecium species and Amoeba species, okay, to deduce the living processes in this protozoa, okay. So try to find out how it carries out locomotion. Observe the locomotion of Euplotes species, its nutrition, all right. In fact, there's something here, a gullet here, okay, there's a gullet here, and then where the food can be swept in, but it's not very clear here. Then for excretion of water, look at an organelle that is found on this side, all right, which is similar to Paramecium species, okay. So observe it first, and in the next slide we'll discuss more about it. So let's view the video. Now observe this organelle here. Observe it now. You can see contracting there. And then observe this cilium. Okay, the stripping of food. This part is very active here. And you see a lot of tiny organisms. What are these? These may be bacteria, alright? Which is the food for Euplotes species. Now let's discuss 3 living processes in Euplotes species. A protozoa that walks. Amazing, isn't it? So for locomotion, this protozoa uses cilia, or groups of cilia are called cirri, alright, to swim and to walk, alright. So here we see a few cilia that seems to act like the front legs, right, for crawling or walking. And then here are some stiff cilia also at the back here that you can see afterwards is moving like a set of back legs, right, for this single-celled organism. So it's quite amazing, right, that it can do that, to swim and also to walk on vegetation and on air bubbles and so forth. And now for nutrition. It also uses tufts of cilia here, right, for feeding. That means to sweep the food particles into the gullet here, which is a channel, right, that will cause the food particles to go into the cell here. Okay, that will channel the food particles into the cell here, and then the food will be enclosed in food vacuoles and digested by enzymes, just like for Paramecium. Then for excretion of water, this cell uses a contractile vacuole, okay, just like for Amoeba species and Paramecium species, to carry out osmoregulation. That means the excess water will fill the contractile vacuole, okay, excess water in the cell will fill the contractile vacuole, then the vacuole will expand to its maximum size and contract suddenly to expel the water or to excrete the water out of the cell, okay. So afterwards, at the beginning, you can see the vacuole contracting once, and somewhere near the end of the video. And by the way, what are all the tiny dots here? You will see it swimming around. Those are probably bacteria, which is one of the food for this Euplotes species. Okay, so here it looks like it has a black speck here that acts like looks like an eye, but it could be a food particle enclosed in a vacuole. Okay, we are not sure. And then here is like a tuft of hair, right? So it looks a bit like a cartoon character. Okay, and this looks like the legs in the cell or of the cell. So let's watch the video to see the 3 living processes. Look at this part here, the white circular part here, that's the contractile vacuole. It's going to contract very soon. There it goes. It's contracting. And here you can see the cilia moving very fast to create a water current and to sweep the food particles into the gullet here. You can see a lot of activity or movement here, right? Okay, so it's feeding. Okay, and these black dots are the bacteria that can be also eaten by Euprotist species. Right now, you can see the contractile vacuole again, now contracting again, right? And then these are like legs like that, they can move back and forth, okay, to help Euprotist species walk on surfaces. Right, so by referring to sources in the net, we can obtain and draw a picture of the structure of Euprotist species, as I've drawn here. Okay, so here you can see that this organism has the cilia here, okay, like a tuft of hair on the head, right, which help to sweep the food into the gullet. Okay, this is the gullet here, not very clear. And then it has a cilia at the front and the bottom part here, which are quite stiff and can be used like legs, in inverted commas, to help the organism crawl on surfaces and also to swim. Okay, and then all the specks inside here are the food in the food vacuoles, including this one that looks like an eye. And then we have the contractile vacuole here to expel the excess water, and we've watched its action. So if you have missed it, then you can view one more time here, or just repeat the video. Okay, so it's a wonder that such a tiny organism, a unicellular organism, can carry out all these processes, alright, and that it has organelles, the structures to help it carry out all these processes, including movement and locomotion, crawling on surfaces too. Okay, so also do view the videos in the description box below, okay, to understand more about the processes or activities, living processes in Amoeba species and Paramecium species. Okay, so the videos are involving the real cells of Amoeba species and Paramecium species as seen through the microscope. Alright, so they are quite interesting. And that's all for this lesson. I hope you've enjoyed the teaching video and also this video on Euprotist species, which is very special. Alright, and do share, like, and subscribe. Till we meet again, goodbye for now. Okay, observe the contractile vacuole here. It's going to contract very soon. There's the contraction. Observe the cilia, the beating of the cilia here. Observe this part here. Okay.